Emma Turner thought her birthday would be a day of joy, not the last day of her life. Her husband, Jacob, smiled as he handed her the perfect celebration she'd always dreamed of: flowers, cake, and laughter that filled their cozy suburban home. But beneath that calm, loving mask hid a storm of rage and jealousy waiting to erupt. When the candles burned low and the guests were gone, Jacob's gift revealed its true horror. By morning, the perfect couple on Willow Lane would become the darkest headline in town. The morning light fell softly across the neat suburban home of Emma and Jacob Turner, illuminating the delicate birthday decorations Emma had stayed up late arranging. Balloons in pastel colors floated near the ceiling, and a banner that read "Happy Birthday, Emma" stretched across the living room wall. The air smelled faintly of vanilla frosting and coffee. From the outside, it looked like the beginning of a perfect day, a day that should have been filled with laughter, celebration, and love. Emma moved through the house, humming quietly to herself, her heart light with excitement. She had planned a small gathering for that evening, inviting a few close friends and neighbors. It was her 32nd birthday, and though life had been stressful lately, she wanted this one day to feel special. Jacob sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee that had long gone cold. He watched Emma move about the house with a distant, unreadable gaze. To Anne Donnelsa, he might have seemed tired or distracted, but there was something darker behind his stillness. He offered small nods and polite smiles whenever Emma glanced his way, but his thoughts were far from the cheerful morning around him. Inside, he was rehearsing every detail of the day, going over it again and again, making sure nothing would go wrong. Their marriage had once been filled with affection and promise. When they first moved into this house on Willow Lane, they were a team, laughing as they painted the walls, dreaming about the future, talking late into the night about children they would one day have. But that dream had faded slowly, replaced by tension that neither wanted to admit. Jacob's small business had failed 2 years earlier, and though Emma had supported him at first, her patience began to wear thin. She had gone back to teaching full-time to keep them afloat, while Jacob stayed home, drowning in guilt and quiet anger. What had begun as frustration turned into resentment. To the neighbors, however, the Turners remained the picture of happiness. They waved when they walked their dog, shared polite, small talk at barbecues, and posted cheerful pictures online. No one saw the cracks forming beneath that perfect surface. Emma had become quieter, more cautious with her words, as though afraid to trigger another argument. Jacob, meanwhile, withdrew into himself, carrying a bitterness he no longer tried to hide when they were alone. The distance between them grew so wide that even simple gestures, like a smile or a touch, felt rehearsed. Emma hoped her birthday might ease some of the tension. She wanted to believe they could start fresh, that perhaps a night surrounded by friends could remind Jacob of happier times. She baked her own cake, choosing her favorite recipe from her mother's old cookbook, and even laid out the dress she wore on their first anniversary. When she asked Jacob if he was excited for the evening, he smiled faintly and said he had something special planned for her. She didn't ask what it was. The idea that he might be trying to surprise her felt comforting, a small sign of the man she had once fallen in love with. But Jacob's thoughts were far from kind. He had convinced himself that Emma no longer loved him, that she pitied him instead. Every smile she gave felt fake. Every kind word sounded hollow. The gift he promised her wasn't one of affection, but of control, a final act meant to end his humiliation. He had spent weeks planning every detail in silence, disguising his preparation beneath the routine of daily life. To him, this wasn't madness. It was justice twisted by pride. As the clock ticked toward noon, Emma placed the last of the decorations on the dining table, completely unaware of the danger quietly building in her own home. The sunlight, filtering through the windows, made the room glow with warmth, the kind that belongs to a happy family, not a battlefield waiting to erupt. Jacob stood at the doorway, watching her laugh softly to herself as she adjusted the flowers. For a brief moment, something inside him hesitated, a flicker of the love he once felt. but just as quickly, it vanished beneath the weight of his hatred. Eternit Hawaii. His expression hardening. The day that should have been a celebration was destined to end in tragedy, and the first signs of darkness had already begun to take root in the bright morning light. Jacob Turner's transformation into the man he had become didn't happen overnight. It began with small disappointments, missed opportunities, quiet failures, and a growing sense that life was slipping out of his control. He had always seen himself as the kind of man who could provide, protect, and succeed. But when his construction business went bankrupt, that image shattered. The debts piled up, the calls from creditors became constant, and soon, Emma was the one carrying the weight he could no longer bear. At first, she handled it with grace, assuring him things would get better, that they were a team. But as months turned into years, her reassurances grew thin, and her patience wore away like sand in the tide. Jacob noticed the shift in her eyes before she ever said a word. There was pity in them now, soft and heavy, as if she had stopped seeing him as her husband and started seeing him as a burden. That pity burned deeper than any insult could. He told himself she was ashamed of him, that her friends whispered about how she worked while he stayed home. He started listening for her laughter on the phone. Convinced she was hiding something, he checked her messages when she slept, searching for proof of betrayal that didn't exist. Every smile she gave another man, every late meeting at school, every missed call became evidence in the twisted courtroom of his mind. The anger came slowly at first, creeping in through ordinary moments. He'd hear her humming while cooking and feel a strange irritation rise in his chest. When she suggested they sell his old tools to make space in the shed, he felt his blood boil. Each innocent remark, each small decision, became an attack on his pride. He couldn't admit that he was the one who had failed, so he convinced himself that Emma was the reason for his misery. If she hadn't changed, if she had loved him the same way she once did, everything would be fine. That belief grew like poison, feeding his resentment until it took over everything else. In the weeks leading up to Emma's birthday, Jacob's paranoia deepened. He began watching her more closely, studying her routines as though preparing for an exam. When she left for work, he'd check her drawers, her car, even her laptop, searching for hidden secrets that weren't there. He wrote her name in the margins of his old notebooks, filling the pages with angry scrolls and half-formed thoughts. Each time he read her texts to friends, harmless messages about school or groceries, he twisted their meaning until they sounded cruel in his head. He no longer saw Emma as his wife. She had become his enemy, the person who made him feel small. Yet, beneath his fury, there was still a trace of longing, a faint, desperate hope that she would turn to him one night, touch his face, and tell him she still loved him. But that moment never came. The more Emma tried to bridge the distance, the colder Jacob became. He started sleeping on the couch, claiming insomnia, though in truth he lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking of ways to make her understand the pain he felt. He began visiting hardware stores under the excuse of fixing the shed. To Gawasan. Repairing anything. Each trip brought him closer to a decision he didn't dare name, a line he hadn't yet crossed but was getting ready to. Emma, lost in her own exhaustion, didn't see the danger. She believed the silence in their home was temporary, that one day Jacob would find his footing again. She planned her birthday with a kind of hopeful determination, thinking that a simple celebration might heal some of the cracks between them. Jacob watched her enthusiasm with a hollow smile, every gesture feeding the storm inside him. Her laughter, once the sound that comforted him, now felt like mockery. He began imagining the end not just of their marriage, but of her. By the time her birthday approached, Jacob's thoughts had hardened into something cold and final. He saw her upcoming parties the perfect setting. People would come, they would laugh, and when they left, no one would suspect what was waiting behind closed doors. To him, it felt like destiny, as though everything that had gone wrong in his life had led to this one moment. He no longer viewed himself as a husband or even as a man capable of remorse. He was the victim in his own story, and Emma, in his delusional mind, was the one who had written his downfall. What he didn't realize was that the monster he blamed her for creating had always been their quiet, waiting, and now fully awake. The day of Emma's birthday dawned bright and calm, with sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows and birds singing outside as if the world itself was celebrating her. Emma moved through the house with quiet excitement, setting up the table and checking the oven every few minutes to make sure her cake baked perfectly. She wore a light blue dress, the same one she had worn during their honeymoon in Lake Tahoe, as if wearing it could bring back the happiness that once filled their lives. Jacob sat on the couch, pretending to scroll through his phone while watching her. His expression was unreadable, a mix of cold calculation and forced serenity. The plan he had built in his mind for weeks was finally coming to life, yet his face revealed none of it. Friends began arriving just before sunset, the small house on Willow Lane filled with laughter, chatter, and the sound of music playing softly in the background. Emma's friends hugged her, handed her gifts, and told her how beautiful she looked. She smiled genuinely for the first time in weeks, her heart warmed by the love around her. Jacob greeted everyone with perfect manners, offering drinks and making polite conversation, blending seamlessly into the cheerful scene. No one noticed the stiffness in his movements or the strange detachment in his eyes. He laughed when others did, nodded at stories he barely heard, and maintained the illusion of a devoted husband flawlessly. As the night went on, the energy grew livelier. Someone brought out candles, and Emma's friends gathered around her as she made a wish. She closed her eyes, thinking of peace, of new beginnings, and of finding happiness again. When she blew out the candles, Jacob clapped the loudest, his smile wide and sharp. He leaned in, kissed her cheek, and whispered something that made her blush faintly. No one could have imagined that, beneath that gentle gesture, a storm of hatred was waiting to erupt. By the time the clock struck 11, the guests began to leave one by one, their laughter echoing faintly as they stepped out into the cool night. Emma thanked each of them warmly, hugging them at the door, her eyes bright with exhaustion and joy. When the last car drove away, silence settled over the house. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock broke the stillness. Emma turned to look at Jacob, smiling softly, unaware that his gaze had turned darker. She began clearing the dishes from the table, humming the same tune she had that morning. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest, not with fear, but with an unnerving calmness that frightened even him. He watched her move around the kitchen, her back turned to him, and every small sound, a clink of glass, the rustle of paper plates seemed to echo like thunder in his mind. He thought about all the moments he had felt small beside her, all the times she had looked at him with what he believed was pity. The thoughts consumed him, twisting his memories until love and hate blurred together. To him, this was the moment he would take back control of his life, end the humiliation he felt every day. He stood up quietly and walked toward the counter where he had hidden what he called her final gift. When Emma turned around, she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before: emptiness. Cold and absolute. There was no anger, no shouting, no warning. It happened swiftly, in one irreversible moment that shattered the illusion of normalcy forever. The sound that followed wasn't loud, but it was enough to draw the attention of the dog that barked frantically from the other room. Within seconds, the celebration turned into chaos. Balloons still hung from the ceiling. The half-eaten cake sat on the table, and the scent of vanilla filled the air as the life Emma had built came to a brutal end. Jacob stood over her motionless body, breathing heavily, the weight of what he had done slowly sinking in. For a brief moment, he felt nothing, no guilt, no horror, just silence. The house that had been filled with light and laughter only an hour earlier now felt suffocatingly dark. He looked around at the remnants of the party, the empty glasses, the scattered ribbons, the birthday banner, and realized the cruel irony of what he had done. He had destroyed her on the very day meant to celebrate her existence. Outside, the street remained peaceful, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. No one knew what horror had unfolded behind those walls. Jacob walked to the sink, washed his hands slowly, and stared at his reflection in the window. He didn't look like a killer. He looked ordinary. That realization chilled him more than the act itself. As the clock struck midnight, Jacob turned off the lights and stood in the darkness, surrounded by the ghosts of laughter that had vanished, leaving only the monster he had finally become. The next morning, Willow Lane awoke to a strange stillness that seemed to hang in the air. The early sun fell softly over manicured lawns and quiet driveways, but something about the Turner house felt off. The curtains were still drawn, the car unmoved, and the usual sound of Emma humming through the open kitchen window was missing. Neighbors noticed, though no one thought much of it at first. It wasn't until mid-morning, when a delivery driver knocked repeatedly with a package that went unanswered, that suspicion began to stir. Within hours, that quiet street would become the center of a nightmare no one could have imagined. Inside the Turner home, the aftermath of the previous night's celebration was frozen in eerie stillness. The remnants of the birthday party were still scattered across the dining, table-empty wine glasses, melted candles, and the half-eaten cake Emma had been so proud of. Balloons drifted along the ceiling, their strings brushing against chairs, as if mocking the happiness that once filled the room. In the kitchen, the horror of what had happened was painfully clear. Emma's lifeless body lay surrounded by the wreckage of her final celebration, the faint scent of vanilla frosting still lingering in the air. Jacob sat in the living room, motionless, his mind blank. He had spent the night pacing, trying to think of what to do next. At first, he thought of running. Then, he considered calling the police and pretending to be a grieving husband who had woken to find his wife gone. But the longer he sat there, the harder it became to believe his own lies. His hands trembled as he finally picked up his phone, dialing with robotic precision. When the dispatcher answered, his voice was flat, almost detached. He said he had found his wife dead, that someone must have broken in. The lie came out easily, but even he could hear the hollowness in his tone. When the first police officers arrived, Jacob met them at the door, his expression blank and his eyes distant. He told them the story he had rehearsed, how they had gone to bed after the party, how he had woken to find the back door open and Emma gone, and how he discovered her body in the kitchen. The officers listened quietly, but something about him unsettled them. His lack of emotion, his calmness, the way he spoke without ever once asking if she could be revived at all felt wrong. Detectives arrived shortly after, cordoning off the area with yellow tape as forensic teams moved through the house. The cheerful decorations from the night before now looked grotesque in the harsh daylight. Cameras clicked, voices murmured, and the once peaceful home became a scene of methodical investigation. It didn't take long for inconsistencies to appear in Jacob's story. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints except his own, and nothing missing from the house. The so-called intruder he described had left behind everything except death. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, whispering in disbelief as they watched officers move in and out. Emma had been loved by everyone. She was kind, polite, and full of life. Jacob, on the other hand, had always been harder to read quiet. Distant, polite, but cold. Now, as he sat on the porch with his hands cuffed, his face pale and unreadable, the community began to see him for what he truly was. Reporters arrived within hours, their cameras capturing every detail of the tragedy that would soon make headlines. A devoted wife murdered in her own home, on her birthday, by the man who was supposed to protect her. At the station, detectives questioned Jacob for hours. He repeated his story again and again, insisting that an intruder had done it. But evidence began piling up quickly. A set of gloves, smeared with blood, was discovered in the backyard shed. His fingerprints were on the weapon. Even worse, traces of Emma's blood were found on the sink where he had washed his hands. When confronted with these findings, Jacob didn't react. He simply stared at the wall, as if listening to something no one else could hear. By the end of the day, the truth was no longer in doubt. Jacob Turner was arrested for the murder of his wife. As he was led out of the station in handcuffs, flashbulbs went off, and reporters shouted questions he refused to answer. To the world, he looked calm, almost indifferent to man whose soul had emptied long before his crime. Back on Willow Lane, the Turners' home stood silent once more. The birthday decorations still fluttered in the breeze through the open window, a haunting reminder of the life that had been taken and the monster who had been hiding in plain sight. The courtroom was silent as Jacob Turner entered, dressed in a plain gray suit that hung loosely from his shoulders. His hair was neatly combed, his face pale and expressionless. Reporters filled the benches, their cameras ready to capture the man the media had already dubbed the monster husband. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made every movement, every whispered word, sound louder than it should. Across the room, Emma's family sat in the front row, their faces drawn with grief. Her mother clutched a framed photograph of her daughter, refusing to look at the man who had taken her life. The trial drew national attention, not just for the brutality of the crime, but for its timing, a murder on the victim's birthday, planned by the person she trusted most. The prosecution laid out the evidence with methodical precision. Photos of the crime scene, messages that showed Jacob's growing resentment, and witness statements about the tension in their marriage painted a clear picture of a man consumed by jealousy and pride. The gloves and weapon found in the shed sealed his fate. Forensic experts testified about the traces of blood that matched Emma's DNA, and even the sink water showed residue from where he had tried to wash his hands clean. Each fact chipped away at whatever image Jacob had left of innocence. The defense tried to argue that Jacob had suffered a mental breakdown, that years of financial stress and emotional strain had driven him to the edge. They painted him as a man who loved his wife, but snapped under pressure. But the jury saw through it. The level of planning, the timing, the cleanup. The false story about an intruder told a different story, one of cold calculation. When the prosecution showed the photos of Emma's birthday table, still decorated with ribbons and balloons, the courtroom went quiet. The sight of a half-eaten cake beside the weapon that ended her life left even the most stoic jurors visibly shaken. Jacob remained still through it all. He never cried, never spoke, never met the eyes of the people watching him. Even when the verdict was read guilty of first-degree murder, his face did not change. There was no outburst, no plea for mercy, no visible sign of regret. He stood as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, then nodded once before being led away. It was as if he had accepted his fate long before the trial began, as if he knew this was how his story would end. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed as reporters shouted questions about justice, love, and evil. Emma's mother, through tears, told them that no sentence could ever undo the pain her family would carry. She said her daughter had loved her husband until the very end, never realizing the danger she lived beside. Her words echoed through the media for days, becoming the voice of countless others who had lost loved ones to the same kind of hidden violence. Years passed, and Jacob faded from headlines, confined to a small cell where the world forgot him. Those who remembered him did so only as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how darkness can exist behind the most ordinary smiles. Emma's story, however, continued to live on. Her colleagues at the school planted a garden in her honor, a quiet place filled with flowers she loved. Each spring, the students would gather there to remember the teacher who had once brightened their classrooms with laughter. Her name was spoken not in sorrow, but in memory of kindness and light. In the neighborhood where she had lived, the Turner house was eventually sold, though few wanted it. Some said they could still feel a chill when passing by. Others claimed to see the faint glow of light in the kitchen window late at night. But, over time, even those whispers faded. The street moved on, though it was never quite the same. The tragedy left an invisible mark, a reminder that evil often hides where love once lived. Jacob spent the rest of his days in silence, avoiding other inmates and speaking only when necessary. Some guards said he spent hours staring at the wall. Others that he whispered to himself about how none of it was his fault. In his final years, he stopped speaking altogether, as though his voice had finally been swallowed by the emptiness he had created. When he died quietly in his sleep, there was no funeral, no visitors, no one to mourn him. His name faded into the archives of forgotten crimes. But Emma's story endured. Her garden continued to bloom every year, and those who passed by still paused to admire it. In that small, quiet corner of the world, life went on. Proof that even in the shadow of monstrous cruelty, goodness could still find a way to grow.